Flying boats played an unforgettable role throughout World War II, marking their finest hour. For anti-submarine warfare, long-range transport, and air-sea rescue, these waterbirds were indispensable. From twin-engine patrol planes to giant six-engine bombers, they offered versatility and mobility to combatants on both sides of the war. And to its crew, the flying boat offered a distinct way of life and duty unmatched by any other type of aircraft.
It is the end of 1941. A squadron of Japanese pilots is launched from an aircraft carrier with the command, "Climb Mount Nitaka." Sunday, December 7th, the infamous day that will drag the United States into World War II. The Japanese air raid on Pearl Harbor will present a devastating example of carrier air power and foreshadow the future of modern naval warfare. Ironically, the surprise attack of these advanced fighter aircraft was almost thwarted by an old mainstay of naval aviation. A PBY patrol flying boat spotted a Japanese submarine less than 2 miles off the entrance to Pearl Harbor, 1 hour and 24 minutes before the attack. Acting in accordance with standing orders, the pilot dropped a depth charge on the intruder and reported his actions to base commanders. Unfortunately, it was the old story of the boy who cried wolf. The message was skeptically received and seen as the latest of many false alarms. The rest, of course, is history. Although the war's great naval battles would be won by the smaller carrier aircraft, ultimate victory hung in the balance of all naval air operations. A partnership that owed its success to the first days of naval aviation, long before a carrier had even been built. In 1911, Glenn Curtiss had perfected his hydroaeroplane at North Island Naval Base in San Diego, California, and delivered the U.S. Navy its first aircraft. But it was the flying boat, developed soon after, that gave the Navy the weapon it needed to cope with the changing face of modern warfare. These larger seaplanes could hold more fuel for extended flights and carry sizable bomb loads. When World War I introduced aerial combat, the flying boat distinguished itself as an aircraft that could patrol vast coastlines and fly far out to sea to attack submarines, the other new weapon of modern warfare. A capability that would prove essential in the next World War. This is the U.S. Coast Guard Air Station in San Diego, California, just prior to World War II. Over the last 30 years, the flying boat has become the mainstay of both Coast Guard and Navy patrol. This Hall PH-3 has served the Navy and Coast Guard extremely well throughout the 1930s. With its short takeoff capability and superior rough sea handling, it is ideally suited for air-sea rescue operations. But as a biplane, its days are numbered. Just blocks away from the Coast Guard station, the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation is busy building the latest and greatest addition to the Navy's Air Patrol Wing, the PBY Catalina. Nothing short of right is right. The slogan at the Consolidated plant in San Diego was taken to heart when they built the PBY. With bulkhead compartments, the hull of the PBY resembled a ship more so than an aircraft fuselage. All metal in construction, the PBY was the first of the Navy's seaplanes not to be designed with wires, fabric, and glue. The first production PBY-1 was accepted in 1936. More than 3,300 PBYs would eventually be produced, the largest number of a single flying boat type ever built. The PBY's maximum range far exceeded that of any other Navy plane, nearly 4,000 miles. For the first time, the Navy had an aircraft that could link the U.S. with its Pacific holdings and extend the defense perimeter far out to sea. Those who foresaw the coming of war considered this capability vital to America's security. And as war approached, the Navy began taking its new aircraft straight from the consolidated plant for evaluation. Soon, San Diego Bay was teeming with PBYs. Today, San Diego Bay is still teeming with boats, but none have wings. In fact, today, there is not one flying boat serving in the U.S. Navy or Coast Guard. San Diego Bay has changed in 60 years. The old consolidated sea ramp facility is now a vacant lot. North Island Navy Base has evolved substantially since Glenn Curtiss first developed the flying boat. Across the bay, the U.S. Coast Guard Air Station is still in operation. Semper paratus, always prepared. When America entered World War II, the Coast Guard had been prepared to do its part as a component of the U.S. Navy. Stan Mahoney remembers using its seaplane facility for testing PBYs.
We used to taxi our PBYs, which were built right over here at Consolidated, taxi them right down here over this ramp and into the water because they were amphibious. Then we would test the PBYs by taking off San Diego Bay here, and we would probably test about 2 or 3 PBYs a day. When we got through with one, we'd go back and get another one, taxi it down, and do it all over again. That's kind of a nice remembrance. Looking at the old ramp there, it was kind of fun taxiing a PBY across that harbor drive and look down and wave at the people as you went by, you know. Kind of brings back memories.
The amphibian version of the PBY was delivered to the Navy in 1941. With tricycle landing gear, it could operate from land as well as water. These later models were also configured with transparent waist blisters housing gunner stations with .50 caliber machine guns. With increased production, the PBY set the standard for the Navy's long-range patrol as it could remain aloft for over 18 hours. Meanwhile, Consolidated had been producing its next aircraft for the Navy, the PB-2Y Coronado. This 4-engine flying boat was designed to meet the Navy's newest requirement for a large, long-range patrol bomber. While it provided greater cargo space than that of the PBY, the Coronado's deep hull was in fact necessary to facilitate a water takeoff for such a large aircraft.
You can get a lot of speed up, but unless you can get it to rocking and break the suction between the hull and the water, you just bounce along like a good boat. And when you get it broken loose, that's when you start picking up speed and get airborne. That's where the Coronado had it over the PBY, because they had this big square tube that went down and vented the step in the hull, and give a little air in there to break the suction. That was a big help.
By the end of the 1930s, war was imminent on both sides of the globe. In the middle stood an isolationist America, adamantly opposed to any foreign entanglements. As the Coronado went into production, and the PBY promised a reliable patrol bomber, U.S. defense planners did the best they could to prepare for war, despite America's isolationist mood. And when war finally came, the flying boat proved both stalwart defender and ferocious attacker. After Great Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, it was not long before Hitler would overrun Northern Europe. In less than 1 year, England would stand alone against Hitler's Luftwaffe. But with England came the entire British Commonwealth of Nations, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and South Africans all comprised a fighting force capable of withstanding 6 years of warfare on both sides of the globe. From the beginning, only the British Navy, key to England's survival, stood in the way of German naval control of the North Atlantic. To keep German raiders from attacking Allied shipping, the Royal Navy would now need the help of reconnaissance aircraft more than ever. Impressed with the PBY's performance, the British had ordered 50 PBY-5s in 1939 and named them Catalinas. The U.S. Navy liked the name and officially adopted it in 1941. In the spring of that year, Catalinas of the Royal Air Force's Coastal Command would deliver the British Navy a decisive victory in the North Atlantic. It is the end of May. The British Navy has been desperately searching for the 45,000-ton German battleship Bismarck, now at large in the North Atlantic. The Bismarck has already demolished one British battle cruiser and poses a serious threat to vital British convoys. RAF Catalinas join the hunt, and on May 26th, a PBY pilot sights the elusive Bismarck. As the Catalinas track the German raider, the British Navy closes in for the kill. While a formidable warship, the Bismarck is no match for Britain's numerical superiority. As she sinks to the bottom, so does Germany's hopes for maintaining a threatening surface navy. Thanks to the vigilance of the Catalina, British Coastal Command will continue to protect England's supply line and thereby frustrate Germany's attempts to strangle the British Isles into submission. One of 3 major RAF operational commands, Coastal Command was charged with maritime reconnaissance. Perhaps no other aircraft epitomized Coastal Command during World War II more so than the Short Sunderland. Built by the Short Brothers Aircraft Company, the Sunderland was an anti-submarine and long-range patrol bomber. The Sunderland's design benefited from the success of its commercial predecessor, the Short S-23C class. Called Empire flying boats, they had enabled Imperial Airways to establish vital air links throughout the British Empire. Serving mostly on anti-submarine and long-range reconnaissance patrols, the 4-engine Sunderland was a sturdy and dependable workhorse for its 10-man crew. Vic Hodgkinson, a Sunderland skipper of the Royal Australian Air Force, served in the North Atlantic.
The Sunderland was a very good aircraft. It took a lot of punishment, though we didn't have any armour plate in it. Later on they put some armour plate around the skipper. It wasn't a fast aircraft, but it had an endurance of, as I say, about 12 hours, the early ones. It was a good seaboat. It was fairly manoeuvrable. For a slow airplane, it was quite manoeuvrable.
Maneuverable and considerably armed, the Sunderland could withstand heavy onslaughts from German fighter aircraft, such that the Luftwaffe nicknamed it the Flying Porcupine. It was the first flying boat to be equipped with power-operated bow and tail gun turrets, 8 .303 caliber machine guns in all, 2 at the front, 4 in the rear, and 2 at the midsection.
Apparently called the Porcupines because of the amount of armament we had on board the aircraft, which was, I suppose, quite a large amount for an aircraft in those days, but really it was very primitive. And the Germans thought we had cannon on board, thank heavens, because they normally gave us, in my day, gave us a wide berth. But the 303, as I mentioned, had a very poor range against the cannon. But close in, of course, you had the concentration of firepower. If you get them in close enough, then you had a chance of doing some damage.
Time was spent avoiding rather than attacking German aircraft. Instead, Sunderlands pursued a more stealthy quarry, the U-boat. Armed with mines, bombs, and depth charges, the Sunderland could be a deadly opponent. But more often than not, the German U-boat outpaced the lumbering Sunderland, stealing below the ocean's surface before damage could be done. This outcome was not entirely unsatisfactory.
Submarine work, of course, we flew patterns over an area where the submarines were expected to be. Mainly on the roundabout between the 100-fathom line off the coast of France and inshore. We didn't fly much closer than about 50 miles off the French coast. And the idea there was to keep the submarines under the water until they reached the 100-fathom line, which meant that they had to use their batteries. And by the time they got the 100-fathom line, they had to surface anyhow to charge them again. So that was the reason for that exercise. And of course, other times you met them further out to sea.
Sunderland, of course, was a gentleman's aircraft. I mean, it had upstairs, downstairs, galley, wardroom, flushing loo.
So the impressive thing about it is carries all mod cons aboard. You have your own kitchen and everything else there, and bunks and what have you.
The Flying Porcupine, it was actually because of the armour we had. You see, we had a mid-upper turret, and we had a front turret which had 4 Browning 303s. Then they altered that because after a while the subs started fighting back from the surface. They put fixed gun positions in, and we had 4.5 cannons in the front. The idea being that you could hit the subs as you were coming in to take them, and that would knock them out or knock their gunners out. And we also had 2 waist positions where we had .5s on swivels, so they used to come out of the side. Yes, we were. They did call us the Flying Porcupines. JQ-88s were the main people we worried about because they used to have a good range and they could come out, as far as we were.
Although the element of surprise was the U-boat's strong point, it operated best not beneath, but above the water's surface. It could move faster and destroy ships with greater accuracy and firepower. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once stated that the only thing that ever frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. With France, Norway, and the Low Countries lost to Hitler's war machine by 1940, the entire Atlantic seaboard from Norway to the Spanish border lay at Germany's disposal. U-boats ranged freely from French Atlantic bases out of the Bay of Biscay and wreaked havoc on British merchant shipping. Convoy escorts and their airborne guardians were needed more than ever as the Atlantic lifeline was stretched dangerously thin. In August of 1941, just prior to America's entry into the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill meet secretly on the USS Augusta to sign the Atlantic Charter, setting forth the aims of the war against Germany. A peculiar meeting between an active belligerent and a technically neutral country. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the United States has agreed to extend Britain's credit for war supplies, practically committing America's industrial resources to the defeat of Germany. The neutral U.S. was teetering on the edge of war. All that was needed was one final push. The surprise was complete. America's Pacific Fleet had been caught sleeping. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought World War II, finally, to America's doorstep. All of America was in shock. In San Diego, one naval officer, like all Americans, felt barely prepared. Captain Frank DiLorenzo.
Most everybody remembers where they were on the day of Pearl Harbor. I was flying for the Navy out of San Diego, and a bunch of other bachelors, and I had a house right in Coronado, California, and we were just sitting around a Sunday morning drinking Bloody Marys, and we got a telephone call. The fellow said he was a duty officer and said for us to get down to the squadron right away. Well, we thought it was a gag and hung up the phone, and the phone rang back immediately. It said, "Get your butts down to the squadron right now, we're at war." And we turned the radio on, and of course it was all full of the day of infamy, and we went down to the squadron, and mass confusion. We knew we were at war. We didn't know where the enemy was, but we knew we had to fly.
Immediately, attention focuses on America's first line of defense, the coastline. How far off the western coast have the Japanese come? Heavy patrol is imperative. The Coronado is one of the first long-range patrol planes the Navy deploys to guard the vast Pacific coastline. Although there never would be a Japanese invasion of America's coastline, the threat was there and the fear genuine. These large sentinels and other flying boats of World War II became the eyes and ears of the fleet. The Coronado could cover 2,300 miles non-stop to look for enemy activity, keeping the Navy alert and ready for mobilization at a moment's notice. Also, its great size could hold a 12,000-pound bomb load for an immediate attack if necessary. Additional duties included Navy personnel transport. Captain DiLorenzo once had the honor of flying Admiral Chester Nimitz to Pearl Harbor soon after the attack in order to take command of what was left of the Pacific Fleet.
Over Pearl Harbor, we invited the Admiral up to the flight deck and asked him if he would like to look at the site of what the Japanese had done to our fleet, and of course he eagerly accepted. And we flew around and made 2 or 3 turns around Pearl Harbor and around Hickam Field so he could survey all of the damage. And he shook his head and clucked his tongue. It was really a sickening sight. The California was sunk. The Utah had completely turned turtle. Her keel was sticking right straight up in the air. The Arizona had settled as where she is today. And there was oil all over Pearl Harbor, around Fort Island, a couple of inches thick. It was one of the most sickening sights that I have ever seen, and It's been indelibleized in my mind.
The losses suffered were enormous. Except for the 3 aircraft carriers that were luckily out at sea, the entire Pacific Fleet was damaged or destroyed. All 8 battleships were put out of action. Almost all of the aircraft were destroyed. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. Vice Admiral Bull Halsey, commander of the Pacific Carrier Task Force, launches air raids of his own on enemy shore bases to let the Japanese know that America is still a force to be reckoned with. The enemy counterattacks with superior aircraft, piloted by more experienced fighters. The Japanese Zero, although lightly armored, is faster and more maneuverable than the American Wildcat. But with time and training, American carrier fighters will gain the experience needed to eventually beat the Japanese at their own game. The age of the carrier aircraft has arrived. Meanwhile, Midway Island stands alone as America's outpost in the Central Pacific. Its continued survival depends largely on flying boats like the PBY. U.S. carrier aircraft will win the epic Battle of Midway. But before that battle begins, PBYs will report the advance of Japanese vessels and make the first torpedo attacks before the carrier even launches its first aircraft. Another 2-engine patrol bomber played an important part in guarding America's coastlines. From the factory of Glenn L. Martin, who had built the famous China Clipper, came the PBM Mariner. This flying boat was more advanced than the older PBY Catalina. Its distinctive gull wing and more powerful engines produced a faster, stronger aircraft. The popular PBM-3 version joined the U.S. Navy in the spring of 1942 and served exclusively in the Atlantic against German submarines until late 1943. The PBM-3D patrol bomber was equipped with 8 50 caliber machine guns in power turrets at the nose, dorsal, and tail positions. Endowed with airborne radar, it had impressive search capabilities. With an 8,000-pound bomb load capacity, the Mariner effectively and consistently intercepted German U-boats preparing to raid America's Atlantic seaboard.
It may not have been the quickest or the most visually appealing aircraft in World War II. It wasn't the easiest plane to handle, yet the PBY Catalina flying boat became one of the most dependable and respected aircraft ever made.
It was a good airplane. Low altitude, rough weather. She was a tough little beast.
In service, this straightforward, sturdy, and adaptable aircraft proved to be the perfect workhorse across the globe. Capable of operating on both land and water, the Catalina transported supplies, performed long-range patrols, and rescued countless stranded sailors and airmen.
That airplane did everything it was asked to do, and more.
However, it also possessed a darker, more threatening side. In the Atlantic, Catalinas bombed and sank numerous German submarines. In the Pacific, black-painted Catalinas swooped on Japanese ships under cover of night. In 1907, a young motorcycle builder from Hammondsport, New York, developed a fascination with the thrill of flight. His name was Glenn H. Curtiss, and he would be forever remembered as the creator of a unique type of aircraft. Curtiss was a natural-born inventor. After various experiments, he developed an aircraft capable of taking off and landing on water, the flying boat. It wasn't long before the military took notice. In World War I, flying boats were heavily used as reconnaissance planes, primarily for submarine spotting. This marked the start of a new era in naval warfare.
In the First World War, the U.S. Navy really didn't have a land plane capability, so the backbone of U.S. Navy operations was the flying boat. And during World War I, they developed the NC flying boat, which was designed to be a long-range aircraft capable of flying great distances across the Atlantic, which, in fact, one of them did in May of 1919.
After the war, hundreds of surplus planes were sold at low prices, sparking the aviation passion that had gripped America. The flying boat's ability to operate on any calm water surface granted it nearly limitless range, expanding new horizons for aviation. When Pan American launched its luxurious clipper flights to Central and South America, the golden age of the flying boat had dawned. Much like grand ocean liners, Pan Am clippers of the 1930s allowed the wealthy to travel in elegance to far-off places. The Navy also envisioned a strategic role for long-range aircraft to patrol the world's oceans, providing early warnings of any threats to American interests. Soon, the flying boat became an essential element of national defense planning.
The main advantages of the flying boat over wheeled aircraft, certainly in the early stages before the advent of the aircraft carrier, was the great range that they had. Plus, they could land almost anywhere, so they could set down in any number of forward bases. And so that's what made the flying boat a real advantageous platform for Navy operations, particularly in the Pacific, where the Navy was definitely looking towards fighting the next war.
In 1933, the Navy invited proposals for a new long-range patrol aircraft. The Consolidated Aircraft Corporation, already experienced in designing flying boats for the Navy, was eager to win this critical contract. Their lead designer was a skilled engineer named Isaac Macklin Lattin, known to everyone as Mac. In the early 1930s, most planes were still biplanes, with fabric-covered wings held up by a web of steel wires. In a bold approach, Mac Lattin designed a metal monoplane. Its vast wing was mounted on a single pylon above the fuselage, anchored to the hull with only 4 struts, 2 on each side. All flying boats required outrigger floats for stability on water, but these floats became a drawback in the air, creating drag and reducing overall performance. Mac Lattin devised a clever solution, designing floats that folded up during flight to become the wingtips, minimizing drag while adding lift. The Navy was duly impressed, and in June 1935, Consolidated secured a contract for 60 aircraft, the largest military order since World War I. The aircraft that rolled off the production line would become iconic, identified by the code letters PBY, P for patrol, B for bomber, and Y, the prefix for consolidated. The PBY was a sizable plane with a striking appearance.
Here were all those great big, beautiful PBYs. It was love at first sight. And I said, well, I've got to fly those.
Along came a PBY, and it was gracefully soaring above us. And it was so beautiful. In my mind, it was like a soaring eagle. It just soared and made slow turns. And later on, I found out what a devil it could be in combat.
PBY, the Navy calls her. Back in 1935, the first PBYs took to the water and the air. Commonplace today, but then a milestone in the history of aviation.
It became best known as the Catalina, or simply the Cat. With a cruising speed of just over 130 miles per hour, the twin-engine Catalina wasn't especially fast, but it offered remarkable endurance with a range exceeding 3,000 miles and the ability to stay airborne for more than 15 hours. Though it was always susceptible to attack, the PBY's main armament was formidable. It included 2 heavy machine guns mounted in blisters on each side of the rear fuselage. Although initially designed for patrol missions, the PBY could carry 4 1,000-pound bombs or 2 torpedoes, significantly boosting its tactical value for the Navy.
The PBY did everything it was asked to do and more. It covered a lot of ground and it could remain aloft for a great deal of time. Basically, though, it was designed to spot the enemy fleet. Radar was just in its infancy then, and nothing could beat a pair of 2 human eyes in spotting the fleet and reporting it back to home base.
By the late 1930s, the world was becoming increasingly dangerous. In the Pacific, Japan was growing more powerful and aggressive, while in Europe, Hitler's Germany was rearming openly, building a navy to control the Atlantic. Britain and America watched with caution as tensions continued to rise. Both countries recognized that airborne early warning would be crucial in future conflicts. Most admirals still placed their confidence in large gun-armed warships, but a few suspected that air power would decide any upcoming war. They would soon see how accurate this belief was. September 1939, Europe is thrust into war. Britain's first line of defense was the Royal Navy. Many of its ships were equipped with seaplanes launched by catapult to scout beyond the horizon. The challenge was retrieving them. The open sea posed serious risks for landing an aircraft. Multi-engine, long-range patrol planes offered a safer alternative, but Britain's strained RAF didn't have nearly enough of them. In 1940, they ordered a fleet of PBYs to aid in patrolling the Atlantic. It was the RAF pilots who first named the aircraft Catalina. They appreciated the aircraft and soon realized that the B in PBY truly signified bomber. They began using their Catalinas to attack German U-boats. Since the start of the war, Nazi submarine wolf packs had prowled the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, sinking numerous British vessels. The Catalina quickly became a crucial asset in the fight against U-boats, locating and destroying them in growing numbers. However, Germany's formidable surface fleet continued to pose a grave threat. In May 1941, the Cat played a role in securing a significant British naval victory. The Royal Navy was chasing the German battleship Bismarck, 42,000 tons of steel, and the pride of Hitler's battle fleet. In a clash west of Iceland, Bismarck had sunk the British battleship HMS Hood with a direct hit. Only 3 of her crew members survived. The Bismarck then disappeared into the fog.
Somewhere under that mystery of fog, the Bismarck was steaming under forced draft for a safe haven. Then a rift in the clouds, a telltale wake. A Catalina flashed the word, "Quarry sighted."
It was an RAF Catalina patrol plane from Coastal Command that finally tracked down the Bismarck. Its location was relayed, and Britain's Royal Navy moved in to finish the job. The Bismarck went down with only 115 of the 2,400 crew members surviving.
Britain had maintained her supremacy in the North Atlantic with the help of a plane designed to maintain United States supremacy in the Pacific.
The attack on the Bismarck clearly highlighted the value of long-range patrol aircraft in combat. The U.S. quickly took note.
The destruction of the Bismarck That great and powerful ship had to be accomplished to be true to the traditions of the British Royal Navy.
They played their part in a victory which is proudly marked up along with victories of the past, the greatest pursuit and kill in history.
The long-range Catalina was an ideal aircraft for ocean patrols, though getting it in and out of the water required cumbersome beaching gear, making the process slow and laborious. To address this issue, the PBY-5A was introduced, with A standing for amphibian. Featuring a retractable undercarriage, this version of the Cat was equally capable on land or sea. Catalinas were soon stationed at U.S. bases throughout the Pacific, from Midway to the Philippines and from Wake Island to Pearl Harbor. As Japan grew increasingly aggressive, the Navy intensified its daily reconnaissance flights. Then, on a calm Sunday morning in December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor.
So I've seen them coming around one by one. They'd strafe and bomb, and then they make a circle and come around again. They must have made about 3 or 4 passes on each attack. You couldn't believe it, and you didn't think it was happening. The whole sky was black with smoke. Everything was on fire, and there was dead people on the dock, and there was 3 feet thick on the water, and people were going around. It was utter confusion.
The assault not only crippled the American Pacific Fleet, but nearly obliterated the airborne patrol force, with 67 Catalinas severely damaged or destroyed.
They picked a beautiful time. Everybody was saluting the flag. And they weren't saluting their guns.
Pearl Harbor served as a harsh lesson for the Americans. Despite extensive long-range patrols, U.S. forces failed to spot the approaching Japanese fleet. In the aftermath, recruitment offices across the nation were flooded with young volunteers eager to join the fight.
I was very highly agitated at what happened out at Pearl Harbor. We weren't told too much about what happened other than it was a big blow to the fleet. And I joined the Navy the next day thinking that I got to go. December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. My father was going to be the big stopper in my mind. When I came home that afternoon, and he said, "How was school?" I gave him the papers that I needed to get his signature on. And he thought for a long time. And he said, "Well, I'm too old to go, and we're going to be at war." And he said, "You go." And he signed, with tears in his eyes.
Smoke from the burning wreckage at Pearl Harbor lingered for days. But with America now at war, Catalina crews, still reeling from the devastating loss, would soon be at the forefront.
The feel at that time was, we've got to do something, and we've got to do it fast.
Early in 1942, new Catalinas began rolling off the production lines to replace those lost at Pearl Harbor. As new orders flooded into the consolidated factory, the demand for more workers grew in the race to accelerate production.
I'd put on my application that I'd worked with some radios, and of course the interviewer had a drawer that he opened up and he said, "What's that?" I said, "It's a soldering iron." "What's that?" "That's a wire cutter." "You're an electrician." So I became an electrician, and that was when the company was building from very few people, just hiring all the time. And they're consolidated. We were working 11 hours a day and 7 days a week.
The Cat quickly earned the respect and admiration of its crews. A standard PBY crew was composed of 8 members, a bombardier who also served as the bow gunner, a pilot and co-pilot, a navigator, a radio operator, a flight engineer, and 2 waist gunners. Bulkheads divided the plane into 7 watertight compartments. For long patrol flights, the central section was fitted with bunks and a galley to increase crew comfort. Mastering the specialized skill of flying a seaplane required extensive training.
Well, if you ever saw what I call a PBY driver, he had thick wrists and big muscles.
The controls were as big as barn doors, and it took a little bit of muscle to move them. It was unstable. She'd fall off on one wing, or the horse would wander unless you had to fly it every minute of the time. It had the smallest stabilizing tabs, which you had to constantly readjust. Every time somebody moved or the load shifted just a little bit, you had to readjust it. You couldn't relax very long in that airplane, not if you were flying it.
And the real trick on a seaplane landing at any time is to make sure you keep your wings level. You do not want to get afloat into the water at high speed, because it'll turn you around so fast it'll be a wreck.
When you come into land, why, it's a high angle, and then boom, down you come, and it really hits hard, you know. You haven't got no control all of a sudden. Why, you put it into just about a stall just when you about to get to the water, because splat, you come down pretty hard. It landed with a great big splash. Not a touchdown, it was a beautiful landing. But if you didn't keep coming back all the time till you got that big fat duck plowing through the water, then she'd go off the water because there weren't any flaps, anything to kill the speed. That's the one thing about that thing that I consider pretty vicious.
While the PBY had its drawbacks, it also had considerable strengths. As crews learned to operate it, they developed a deep respect for this durable workhorse.
It's a good airplane, very good. Low altitude, rough weather, rain squalls, and she was a tough little beast.
Like a giant seabird, the Catalina glided above the ocean on its lengthy solitary patrols. Its crew would spend hours out of sight of land, scanning the water for the faint sign of a submarine periscope or a downed pilot adrift in a life raft. Keeping the engines running for hours on end was the responsibility of the flight engineer. From his cramped compartment within the wing support, he communicated with the pilot through a system of indicator lights.
The only thing the pilot has regarding the engines in the cockpit are the throttles. Everything else is back there in a tower. He relies on his engineer.
It was the navigator's role to chart their course and ensure the safe return of the aircraft.
It's nice to know where you are. Every once in a while, a crew member that wasn't doing anything would come up and look over your shoulder and said, "Where are we?" Well, you put your finger, right there. But they did trust you, no doubt about it. But sometime, you're going to be lost. You won't know where you are. So what do? You turn around and go back, and you don't know where to go back to? Do you think, well, my sense tells me that land is over there and water's over here, or what do?
In poor weather conditions, this could become an almost impossible challenge. Many lone Catalinas disappeared without a trace in the vast Pacific Ocean. The radio operator served as the only connection to the outside world. His Morse code signals would send critical early warnings of enemy activity back to the base. Soon, the Catalina crews would play a pivotal role in the legendary sea battle that would alter the entire trajectory of the war in the Pacific. Midway.
Midway Island. Not much land, right enough, but it's our outpost. A Navy patrol plane. Routine patrol. Only behind every cloud may be an enemy.
Following the calamity at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese continued to push back American forces across the Pacific. In June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy dispatched a massive task force to seize American-held Midway Island, located 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. The primary goal was to lure the remaining ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a confrontation and destroy them. However, the Japanese codes had been deciphered, and the defenders were aware that an attack was imminent. What they didn't know was the precise location of the task force.
Up until the Battle of Midway, the U.S. Navy, quite frankly, was not having a good war. They had only been able to score some hit-and-run raids against Japanese islands. So the Battle of Midway was very much a showdown in which the U.S. Navy was going to put it all on the line to stop the Japanese fleet.
On the morning of June 3rd, a Catalina patrol aircraft located the leading vessels of the Japanese task force. At dawn the next day, another Catalina finally identified the remaining ships, including the aircraft carriers. A large contingent of American carrier planes took off to engage the Japanese battle fleet. However, the waves of dive bombers faced superior Japanese fighters and suffered devastating losses. Then, in just 10 minutes, the tide shifted dramatically. American dive bombers targeted 3 Japanese aircraft carriers while their decks were crowded with planes being rearmed and refueled. Without air cover, the massive carriers became easy targets and quickly succumbed to American assaults. Later that day, a 4th Japanese aircraft carrier was also lost. Midway represented a catastrophic defeat for the Japanese and marked a pivotal turning point in the Pacific War at sea. At last, U.S. forces achieved a decisive victory, marking the first time the Japanese were forced onto the defensive.
In the Battle of Midway, there were some elements that played a great role, and certainly that was finding where the Japanese fleet was. And code breaking played a role in that, but it still required an aircraft to spot the ships. And it was here that the PBY played a pivotal role in the battle, because it was PBYs that spotted not only the invasion force destined for Midway, but more importantly, spotted the carrier force.
The Catalina had demonstrated its capabilities beyond any doubt, but even before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Navy had already commissioned its intended successor.
The battleship of the air, the Coronado, the mightiest seaborne aircraft now in service.
The Coronado, known as the battleship of the air, was the most formidable seaborne aircraft ever constructed. This 4-engine Coronado was significantly larger and more advanced, yet it cost 3 times as much to produce as the Catalina and was a very intricate machine. In contrast, the Cat was straightforward to manufacture in large quantities, allowing it to remain the Navy's primary workhorse. Much like Henry Ford's Model T, it was slow but reliable and got the job done. However, every crewman flying a Catalina understood that, despite its armament, the sluggish Cat had little chance of surviving an encounter with Japanese fighters. Those long and solitary ocean patrols became some of the most perilous missions of the entire Pacific War.
The Catalina has been called the cruiser of the air. Her wing spread is 105 feet. Her length from nose to tail is 65 feet. She can carry a load of many tons. Her range, fully loaded, is over 4,000 miles, and the PBYs, new and old, have stood up to all the tasks imposed by modern war.
Yet, sometimes, the odds were simply insurmountable. During his first combat patrol in August 1942, Bob Dimmitt's Catalina was unexpectedly attacked by 3 Japanese fighters.
They were real show-offs. They would corkscrew in and roll. I watched one of them coming in on our tail there, and he was just lazily doing rolls and shooting at us. I guess they figured that this was a big duck and it was going. Our radioman was killed. He was sitting right behind me. The mechanic was shot through the chest, and those were the 2 big casualties that we had. The rest of us all had small shrapnel in us.
Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, The Japanese Zeros vanished. One man was killed, another was severely wounded, and the Cat sustained significant damage.
And when we got away from there, our port engine was starting to burn. But that sucker flew, and we noticed some dots on the horizon. Never saw such pretty pieces of palm trees in our life.
Somehow, they managed to crash land the injured Catalina in shallow water, skidding to a stop on the beach.
We stopped. Then we started getting kind of worried, because we really didn't know at that time where we were and whether it was friendly or enemy. So we climbed out of the airplane and stood there with our big 45s in our hands and waited.
After a week stranded on their tropical island, Bob Dimmitt and his crew began to wonder how long they could endure before assistance arrived or the Japanese came.
All of a sudden we see this dot just off the water underneath this black cloud heading right for us, and it looked like a seaplane. Well, at that time, we didn't know whether it was a Japanese seaplane or whether it was an American seaplane, so we didn't do anything. And we waited and waited and waited till the last minute, and then we could finally make out that it was a Catalina. And we were jumping up and down and yelling at him, but Santa Claus has nothing on that airplane. The relief that you feel when you have a friend that just flies by like that, there is, well, you can't describe it. We know then that we're home free.
All but one of Bob's crew made it through the ordeal, thanks to the Catalina. Such close calls had a lasting impact.
Hey, I got news for you. They were all brothers under the skin, boy, after that one there, and there was no doubt about that. We stayed close for a long time. Yeah.
Usually bonding shows up after an incident or an accident. If the pilot manages to evade and get the plane back without being shot down, he is the biggest thing in the world to that crew. So now they've bonded to the pilot, and the crew has bonded together as one. You could see it happen, and when I was on the islands in the South Pacific and the PBYs would come back from their patrol, you could tell that there's a changeover. All of a sudden, they're like brothers. You can't come between them.
Not surprisingly, every American GI in the Pacific grew fond of the Cat. Its recognizable and reassuring silhouette in the sky was always a welcome sight. For troops isolated on remote coral islands, it meant receiving mail from home. For the injured, it brought crucial medical supplies and a ride to the safety of a base hospital. For survivors adrift for days in the vast ocean, it symbolized life itself. And for the men who piloted it, the Cat became part of the family.
Oh, yes. Every hop we came back on, the airplane was our baby. We loved it. We put it to bed at night, wake it up in the morning, and if we had any long flights, it never occurred to us that anything was going to go wrong.
The Cats operated in the most basic conditions, and their crews learned to be almost completely self-sufficient.
You had to be self-sufficient. And those planes were on their own. They'd be at some out-of-the-way island in a cove, and there'd be some 55-gallon drums of fuel and some oil. You lived in the plane, and you ate, cooked, and lived in the plane.
Whether on land or at sea, the big Cats were most susceptible to Japanese air attacks between their missions. However, many of their forward bases were carved out of the jungle and not easily visible from above. The long-distance missions across the Pacific placed immense stress on the aircraft and the dedicated ground crews who kept them operational with only the most rudimentary tools.
Preventative maintenance is the secret to the whole thing. The old saying goes, you can't pull off the road and call for a wrecker. If you have a problem, you lose an engine, you're going to have to return to base. You have a full crew, full ammo, full gas load. Perish the thought that you lose an engine on takeoff.
The remote jungle bases lacked workshop facilities, but this did not deter the Catalina. It came equipped with its own set of folding work platforms that could be attached to the engines.
There you were on a platform. You could work in the whole accessory section.
After a specified number of flight hours, each engine required a thorough inspection.
Each check would be more intense. And you hate to see them coming because that meant that it was going to be work. Not just flying, it was going to be work. You had to get yourself 30. And then you would have the 30, 60, 90, and 120-hour check. Now, 120 hour takes quite a long time. That's 120 hours in the air. Now the airplane's going to be down for a couple of days. In wartime, that's not really well thought of, but it has to happen. So you can imagine that there's a lot of fellas, a lot of mechanics, really running all over that airplane to get it back in the air. That's one thing a pilot doesn't want, is to have his airplane on the deck. It's not what it's built for.
A strong bond formed between the pilot and the chief engineer, as lives depended on their combined expertise. Before every mission, they would meticulously inspect the aircraft together.
It's the rapport that you develop with the pilot. And if you're the chief aboard, or if you're the senior man aboard, or if you're the flight engineer, you're a little bit closer to the pilot than the rest of the crew. He'll come to you first. But he's still in charge. I realized I was the man behind the wrench. I wasn't the man up front driving. Pilot drives it. I fix it.
It's an airplane that you could fix with duct tape or something like that. If it had been too complicated, it wouldn't have been able to do the job.
Yet this reliable companion could also reveal a much more aggressive aspect of its character. When night fell, the gentle cat would turn into a formidable predator.
Guadalcanal is the most hotly contested strip of land in the South Pacific. For 5 months have tried to win back this vital outpost, but their transports, bombed and beached, lie wrecked on the sands of the Solomon Islands.
While Midway marked a turning point at sea, it was Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands that ultimately halted the Japanese ground advance. The situation was dire, as the Japanese funneled troops and supplies into battle, desperately attempting to push American forces back into the sea. The success of the entire Japanese operation hinged on regular supply runs conducted by a fleet of transport ships operating under the cover of night, protected by destroyers and light cruisers known as the Tokyo Express. The only chance for an American victory lay in severing this vital supply line. This goal was ultimately achieved with the assistance of an unexpected weapon.
Anything familiar? That torso with a middle-aged sag? Her speed less than some cars can do. Got her? Right. The old Cat. Navy Catalina patrol boat, PBY in a black nightgown for night camouflage. A black cat.
It was called the Black Cat because they flew at night, and the plane was painted perfectly black.
Despite its age, the Catalina was leading the way in a new type of covert operation that would become an increasingly significant aspect of modern warfare.
During the day, to launch a PBY on any sort of attack mission would have been suicide because it was a slow and lumbering aircraft. But those attributes made it really particularly suited to night combat, where it could loiter over targets and search for them really at will.
For every pound of bombs dropped last month, 1 ton of enemy shipping was sunk or damaged. Records like that mean plenty in any language, dollars or yen.
The concept was simple, yet highly effective. Take a standard PBY Catalina patrol plane, coat it in matte black from nose to tail, conceal its glowing exhaust pipes above the wings, and switch off all navigation lights. Then attach 4,000 pounds of bombs under its wings, transforming it into a formidable weapon. This was the Black Cat, the original stealth bomber.
Another night, another mission, another prowl into the dark. A cat needs its 9 lives on these jobs.
Back at Pearl Harbor, the surprise attack by the Japanese had severely weakened the Catalina fleet. Now, shrouded in darkness, the Cats sought their revenge. This time, it would be the Japanese who were caught off guard. These long-range missions were always tense and exhausting for the Catalina crews.
Skipper always had us doing things. And he'd say, you guys in the blisters, I want you to keep an eye out. And if he ever saw anything, and we didn't see it first, we was in bad trouble. we reported seeing something before he did, or he'd said, all right, what's going on back there? Do you guys sound asleep?
Without radar, the Japanese forces struggled to detect the Cats in the darkness. Even powerful searchlights often failed to reveal their presence, leaving defenders to fire blindly into the night sky in hopes of hitting something.
The searchlight would be right on us, and nobody shot at us. The searchlight come right on, and everything gets all light up in the plane. Said, "Uh-oh!" We just kept right on going, and the light went off somewhere else. So they never did see us. Never would see us.
The attacks had to be executed on the first pass to maintain the element of surprise. But the slow-flying Cat had ample opportunity to align itself with the target.
You know, we dropped bombs. We dropped everything we had. And I don't know, because we never did, nobody ever went down to see what had happened, because that was Japanese territory.
One more flight completed. One less convoy flying the rising sun. Another loss in losses adding up to billions of dollars in equipment that didn't get there.
In just 1 month, a single squadron reported the destruction of 43 Japanese ships as the Black Cats prowled the night skies, most of their victims unaware of what had struck them. Deprived of essential supplies, the Japanese lost their hold on the Solomon Islands and began a long and bloody retreat back to their home islands. At a pivotal moment in history, the Black Cat squadrons, engaging in nighttime hunting and bombing missions, played a crucial role in turning the tide of the war in the Pacific.
A job done by planes that can't maneuver but do, that can't dive, that can't rev up speed to wiggle out of a run but go in anyway for a second try, a third. And every less ship gives the men who are landing a better break. That's what keeps the Cats flying.
When production ceased, nearly 4,000 Catalinas had been constructed, making it the most numerous flying boat ever created.
In a variety of services with a variety of nations, the PBY did everything in almost every theater of war. It dropped bombs, it dropped torpedoes, it depth-charged U-boats, it fired retro rockets. It was the Dumbo for down flyers, the salvation and savior for them when they're floating in the open ocean with little chance of rescue without the PBY. So in short, the PBY performed all missions that it was called upon to do and performed them with great ability.
After the war, while many military aircraft were scrapped, the Cats continued to serve due to their immense utility. Wherever there was water, the Catalina found a peacetime role, conducting Coast Guard patrols, firefighting, cargo transport, passenger flights, exploration, surveying, and a multitude of other tasks. Though the jet age marked the decline of most remaining flying boats, the Cats persevered. As the new millennium approached, the consolidated PBY Catalina remained in the air, one of the longest-serving and most beloved aircraft in history.
That airplane, I fell in love with it.
All I could say was, Mr. Consolidated, you did a hell of a job.
Has there ever been a warplane as mythic as the Mitsubishi Zero? Legend, mystery, and rumor conflated to create an unbeatable fighter flown by samurai tough pilots. The Zero was said to have an awesome performance, superb maneuverability, and combat characteristics an order of magnitude ahead of anything else in the sky. The oft-forgotten fact is that the Zero's effective combat career was measured in months. The Mitsubishi A6M0 is a long-range carrier-based aircraft fighter formerly manufactured by Mitsubishi Aircraft Company, a part of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and was operated by the Imperial Japanese Navy from 1940 to 1945. The A6M was designated as the Mitsubishi Navy Type 0 carrier fighter, or the Mitsubishi A6M Raisin. The A6M was usually referred to by its pilots as the Raisin, or Zero, being the last digit of the imperial year 2600, or 1940, when it entered the service with the Imperial Navy. In the official designation A6M, the A signified a carrier-based fighter, 6 meant that it was the 6th such model built for the Imperial Navy, and M indicated Mitsubishi as the manufacturer. The official Allied report name was Zeke, although the name Zero was used colloquially as well. Not counting its earliest sucker punch missions over China, when the best-trained fighter pilots in the world swatted down scores of ill-flown Polikarpov biplanes and open-cockpit monoplanes. The Zero resigned supreme in the Pacific War, only from the day of the Pearl Harbor attack until American pilots learned the tactics that allowed even pudgy F-4F Wildcats to level the aerial playing field during the Guadalcanal campaign in the summer and fall of 1942. When the second generation of U.S. World War II fighters, the P-38, F-4U, and F-6F arrived beginning in early 1943, the Zero was finished as an effective fighter. In January 1944, a single Marine F-4U pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, shot down 20 Zeros in just 17 days. The Zero soldiered on until the end of the war, of course, many self-immolating as kamikazes, but only because the Japanese had nothing to replace it, and the Zero often was simply a cannon fodder. The June 1944 Marianas Turkey shoot is the most notorious example of such inequity. Not that the Zero wasn't still dangerous even in the 1945s, especially if an aviator was cocky enough to try to dogfight one of the few remaining experienced Zero pilots. Nobody ever built a fighter that could outmaneuver it, and the fact that Grumman developed the F-8F Bearcat as Zero beater, a task that it was to do just a bit too late to fulfill, shows that the Zero was never entirely disdained. The Japanese had counted on a short, brutal war to force the US to the negotiating table in order to establish unfettered area of Japanese exploitation in South Asia and the Pacific. So Japan had done little to prepare for a protracted conflict. Zero pilots were superbly trained, but only hundreds at a time. Then a few thousand a year while the US was turning tens of thousands of college grads into pilots. The great majority of Japanese pilots were the equivalent of our NCOs. Nor was the production of a Zero successor given high priority. Much like the German High Command initially assumed the Me-109 would suffice for the duration of the war and that it didn't need an engineer or a successor, the Japanese waited too long to develop and produce the Shiden, Raiden, and Reppu, or perhaps they should have developed just one of them. It didn't help that Japan, a small island nation with limited engineering and manufacturing manpower, spent its time dithering over the development of more than 90 major combat types as well as several dozen lesser models. By the time they did get serious, raw materials were lacking and the country's skilled airframe and engine workforce had fled the manufacturing centers due to being bombed out of their homes. The Zero was incrementally improved throughout the war, from the A6M2, the first model to take on American fighters, to the A6M8, only 2 ever built, intended to attack B-29s. The Zero's excellent Nakajima-built Sake engine was eventually upgraded by about 150 horsepower, but it never attained anything like the horsepower offered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800, the P-38's twin Allisons, or the P-51's Packard Merlin. The Zero's power-to-weight ratio was always better than that of its US opponents, but sheer horsepower allowed the Americans to loft superior firepower, substantial armor, and overbuilt airframes. What the Japanese needed and never got was not a better Zero, but an all-new fighter, a Japanese Hellcat. When the war ended and the Zero stood down, the US was within a week of introducing yet a third generation of Pacific fighters in the form of the Bearcat. The Zero began the Pacific War with an aura of invincibility. At the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, 521 Zeros were active in the Pacific, 328 in first-line units. The carrier-borne Model 21 was the type encountered by the Americans. Its tremendous range over 2,600 kilometers allowed it to range farther from its carrier than expected, appearing over distant battlefronts and giving Allied commanders the impression that there were several times as many Zeros as actually existed. After Pearl Harbor, it quickly became to be viewed as some kind of mystery ship, imbued with strange powers, able to do things that no other airplane could. Yet it was simply a well-engineered, straightforward, optimized aircraft for maneuverability, and flown against an enemy that had never credited the Japanese with the ability to design a cutting-edge fighter. Even though the Claire Chennault of Flying Tigers had been sent back to the US, reports of the airplane's capability over China, they were ignored, and American aircraft recognition manuals didn't even include a picture of the Zero. As aviation historian William Green wrote, the Zero created a myth. The myth of a Japanese invincibility in the air. Its successive appearance over every major battle area in the opening days of the war seemed to indicate that the Japanese possessed unlimited supplies of this remarkable fighter. And its almost mystical powers of maneuver and ability to traverse vast stretches of water fostered the acceptance of a myth of its invincibility in Allied minds. Zeros often showed up so far from the nearest Japanese-controlled land that the Americans set out in search of the carrier from which it was assumed they'd taken off. The Zero was designed by a team under the direction of the brilliant young aeronautical engineer Jiro Horikoshi. Mitsubishi had the foresight to send Horikoshi to work and observe at aircraft factories in Europe and in the US in 1929, and he even spent several months at Curtiss Plant in New York as an acceptance inspector for a batch of P-6 Hawk pursuit biplanes the Japanese had ordered. Horikoshi had already engineered the Mitsubishi A5M, later codenamed the Claude by the Allies. For an open cockpit, fixed-gear fighter, the A5M displayed outstanding performance, in no small part because of its flush riveting, a production technique that the Japanese would subsequently use on the Zero at a time when American airframers were just discovering its low-drag advantage. In order to fight not only the already overmatched Chinese, but also the Pacific War against the US that was beginning to look inevitable, however, Japan still needed something more than just the Claude. The Japanese would never have attacked Pearl Harbor if they didn't have the Zero. At the time, in fact, some planners had misgivings that there weren't yet enough Zeros available for the attack to succeed. When the Japanese Navy gave Mitsubishi its marching orders as the Zero design began, it demanded a triple threat: an escort with the extreme range that needed to accompany bombers deep into China and later to cover over vast Pacific distances, a point defense interceptor with a rapid rate of climb to hit attacking bombers before they reached their targets, and a consummate dogfighter with extreme maneuverability. Though it's often assumed that the Japanese Army Air Force also flew Zeros, it never did. Another Zero oddity is that though all Japanese naval aviators were carrier qualified, many, including the famous Zero super ace Saburo Sakai, never operated from a carrier in combat. The extreme range criterion resulted in one piece of a little acknowledged pioneering for which the Zero was responsible. It was the first airplane designed from inception to carry an ejectable external fuel tank. A Zero's maximum fuel load, including the belly tank, typically was about 230 gallons. And this gave it 7 or 8 hours of combat endurance. Sakai set the Zero endurance record, just over 12 hours, by throttling back to 1,700 RPM and running what today we'd call lean of peak, maximum height exhaust gas temperature, at just 130 miles an hour. He intentionally ran his tanks bone dry while circling above Formosa Air Base after a mission and dead sticked in from 8,000 feet. Another Zero innovation was its 360-degree view cockpit canopy, second only to the British Westland Whirlwind's bubble canopy. Though it was a multi-pane greenhouse rather than a true bubble, the Zero's glassware provided a considerably better rearward view than anything but a true open cockpit design, and had also excellent drag-reducing properties. It could also be opened in flight but not jettisoned, making parachute egress difficult. It was assumed that a Zero samurai would continue fighting to their death rather than bail out. Most Zero pilots refueled to wear parachutes in any case, until they ultimately were ordered to strap them on. In the late 1930s, the Japanese had developed nothing more powerful than several 800 to 1000 HP radials with little grown potential, at a time when American, British, and German manufacturers were cranking out 1,200 horsepower engines with 2,000 horsepower visible on the horizon. So Horikoshi needed to make his new fighter super light, which he did in part by having lightened holes cut and drilled through every internal airframe part possible, a technique that race car builders would recognize immediately. Horikoshi also persuaded the Navy to change its ultimate load standards for many components he didn't consider crucial. He designed them to fail but then rebound them to previous shape as soon as they were reduced. As a result, the Zero was the fastest 1000 HP radial engine fighter ever produced, but one with a number of single-point failure locations that, if hit, could bring down the airplane. The Zero was skinned with the lightest gauge aluminum possible, and when the shadows were right, some photos of the Zeros in flight show them seemingly clothed in crinkled tinfoil. British test pilot Eric Brown, who flew a captured Zero immediately after the war, even today recalls the constant noise of the oil canning fuselage skin, like the sound produced when one pushes on the side of a large biscuit tin. A typical Zero, loaded with full fuel and ordnance, weighed about 5,500 pounds, less than a mid-sized Cessna twin. A fully loaded Hellcat weighed over twice as much. The single heaviest component of any airframe is the main wing spar. Horikoshi lightened the Zeros by 30% by using a new zinc aluminum alloy called Super Ultra Duraluminum, which had recently been developed by Sumitomo Metals. One major benefit of the 7075 over the Sumitomo metal was that it was very corrosion resistant. In another weight-saving measure, the Zero's main spar was continuous, from wingtip to wingtip, and thus was an inseparable part of the fuselage center section rather than having a left and right wing, each bolted to the fuselage. This eliminated the weight of fasteners and spar buckets. Though it might seem that permanently affixed wings could make a Zero difficult to transport, Horikoshi had designed the entire tail cone and empennage to easily unbolt just aft of the cockpit. With everything removed forward of the firewall as well, the wing and cockpit became a single long but light narrow truckload. Horikoshi's search for lightness led him to the oft-criticized failure to include adequate armor or self-sealing fuel tanks in the Zero design. What was forgotten, however, is that virtually no fighters at the time the Zero was introduced had such features. It remained for the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940 to demonstrate the need for armor and protected tanks. In any case, the Zero's designers considered armor unnecessary because they didn't think anybody would be able to put any rounds into the fighter. Maybe a lucky shot here and there, but not enough of a danger to compromise the design's lightness. Little did they know what the Navy and Marines had in store for them. Most combat units also removed their Zero's radios for additional weight savings, since the Japanese transceiver was very poor quality. This left the Zero pilots unable to warn wingmen of surprise attacks, and they could coordinate their own attacks only with occasional hand signals. A typical multiplane Zero attack was a melee of individual aerobatics, and Japanese pilots were in nearly as much danger of mid-airs with their mates as they were of getting shot at. As one of the USN pilots put it, from the way Zero pilots rollicked around in the sky, at times, it looked as they would rather stunt than fly. Yokonawa flew upside down, having both hands around the cockpit, wrote Sakai in his book Samurai. Then, he flew directly over me, under me, and went through a wide hesitation roll around my fighter. He was like a kid showing off. He finally flew on my wing and held the stick between his knees. Still grinning, he waved his lunchbox at me and started to eat. The Zero's flight controls mixed some ingenious engineering with at least one awkward feature. Its ailerons were large and powerful, which added greatly to the fighter's low-speed maneuverability and spectacular roll rate, but they were very difficult to deflect at high speeds. American pilots soon learned to dive and turn sharply, especially to the right, which substantial prop-induced torque made particularly difficult for the Zero when they had a Zero on their tail. Horikoshi did an interesting job with the Zero's elevator, however. The airplane's speed range was broad, from low-speed maneuvering to flat-out dashes at more than 300 miles an hour, and elevator effectiveness, of course, increased with speed, to the point where it could become quite touchy. So Horikoshi designed an elastic control system, with thin elevator cables that stretched a bit as speed increased and slightly flexible elevator control torque tube. Normally, such a setup would be an anathema to an aeronautical engineer, for it encouraged an elevator to flutter as speeds increased. But somehow, whether through luck or engineering talent, Horikoshi found a sweet spot where there was no danger of flutter, yet elevator control forces remained constant regardless of the airspeed. Zeros were feared in part because of the two heavy wing-mounted 20mm cannons, Swiss Oerlikons built under license by the Japanese. Horikoshi suspected that the Zero would yaw appreciably as first one and then the other cannon fired and recoiled, so he specified for a fuselage longer than its optimal length, which gave the vertical stabilizer a longer moment arm and thus provided greater longitudinal stability. But the Oerlikons were still problematic. They had a low rate of fire, limited capacity, initially only 60 rounds per gun, later increased to 100, and low muzzle velocity. The latter meant that the cannon was effective for close-in fighting, where a single round into a Wildcat's wing, root, or cockpit could mean a kill. But as the distance to a target increased, the cannon's rounds would lose energy and drop away ineffectually, like a softball thrown underhand. A number of the Zero's smaller components, such as instruments and engine accessories, were also license-built Bendix, Sperry, Colesman, and other designs, which could lead to later claims that the airplane was a copy of the Hughes H-1 Racer or the vaguely similar-looking Vought V-143. But as Horikoshi later wrote, we were trying to surpass the rest of the world's technology, not just catch up to it. The Zero's single most important US part was its Hamilton standard design constant speed propeller. The Japanese had also bought a V-143 in 1937, and the Zero's landing gear and retraction mechanism was almost certainly a copy of the Vought's design. After all, the Zero was one of the first retractables the Japanese built. The Zero's 2 cowl-mounted machine guns were not particularly effective, especially against the new generation of heavies overbuilt the US fighters. At little more than a half of the caliber of the American 50 cals, they were used by many Zero pilots mainly as pointers for their cannons. If they saw hits from the machine guns, they toggled the cannons alive and fired them instead. Just like a World War I Spot or Fokker, the Zero's receivers were in the cockpit, above the instrument panel on either side, and the pilot pulled levers to charge them. Ultimately, the Zero's main failing was that it was designed to a 1930s paradigm. Air combat meant dogfighting, and dogfighting, at least in the days before energy management, meant to circle chase in one form or another, with the better airplane turning tighter than the lesser one and eventually getting into a firing position from a rear quarter. Victory was then nearly inevitable. And the Zero was the world's tightest turning, most maneuverable fighter. Thanks to its aerobatic ability, Zero pilots also developed a combat maneuver that initially baffled American airmen, a kind of sideways loop with square turns and side slips out of the turns, which tightened their turn greatly. It didn't take long, however, for American pilots to learn that the rat racing with the Zero was a loser's game, so they disbanded tail chases that played straight into the Zero's only air combat strength. It was neither strong, unusually fast, good in a dive, nor effectively armed. Hit and run became the mantra. Attack a Zero from above, fire while diving upon it, and keep going. Convert diving energy into zooming altitude and do it again if necessary. Perhaps it was inevitable that the Zero would become a myth, a legend, a paragon amongst fighters, when it was in fact a conventional plane with several ahead of its time characteristics. It could be argued that the Zero was an excellent airplane, but a lousy fighter. If you discount the victories over poorly trained Chinese pilots flying outmoded Soviet fighters, the huge fleet of Allied aircraft destroyed while they were parked in the opening days of the war, and the kills of utterly unprepared American pilots in many cases flying adequate airplanes but using the wrong tactics against the Zero, the mythical Mitsubishi comes off surprisingly poorly. It was extremely light and had numerous failure points, where very few rounds of heavy caliber machine gun fire could do catastrophic damage. It was flammable, and its pilots were terribly vulnerable. It was not particularly fast, and in any case, its high-speed handling was poor. Its controls were poorly harmonized. Its armament was a mixed bag of 2 light machine guns and crude cannons. It had no useful communications equipment. Ultimately, the Zero was a bare-bones airplane. Nothing extra, nothing fancy. With very little margin for modification, designs which had little, if any, stretch built into them, wrote Zero expert Robert Mikesh. Some say that because the Zero was the best dogfighter in the Pacific theater, perhaps the world, it was by definition the best fighter. But there's also an old saying, to win, you have to finish. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the Pacific War was one race that the Zero finished last. Dead last.
OK かなこれで。
よーい、スタート。
一番の特徴はですね、私に言わせますならば、 航続力ですね。
長い。
非常に長時間飛べるということです。どんな素晴らしい格闘性能を持っていても、時間がなくてはですね、いい試合は浮かばないですよ。だから私はもう航続力だと思うんです。第2番目が堀越先生、苦心の作であるところのこのエレベーター昇降舵ですね、この機首を上げ下げするこの舵の効き具合が、操縦桿の引き具合とこのエレベーターの効き具合が低速でも高速でも操縦するパイロットの考えてる通り動いてくれるように設計されてる。これがこの格闘性の特に縦の運動ですね、この宙外重を利用した縦の運動、これが非常に優れてたということです。そうですからもちろん真後ろについた場合はですね、どんなに彼らが逃げ回っても絶対我々がこの真後ろへピャッとつけたらですね、だいたい35、6メーターか40メーター、どんな逃げ方してもプロレスで言えばキーロックですね。ガツッとはめたらもう仕留めます。
もう逃げられない。
ほどのことじゃなければ。ただこういう具合にめったになりませんけど、なった時でもこの縦の運動に引っ込めば、だいたい3000点から4000点すれば挽回すると。そのくらいにゼロ戦の特徴というものは、この縦の運動のエレベーターを利用したところの、私なんかは斜め宙返りを利用したひねり込みと言ってましたけど、このひねり込みが古いパイロットには一人味のあるですね、自分流の技をですね、いつの間にか開発していきました。その当時ですね、本当に私たちがラボル国体で油の乗り切ってる頃、ちょうどこのスピンナーの先、この先端ですね、これはこういう感じてましたよ。
一体
それから
なんですね、じゃあ。
この先翼端がですね、この中指に感じてましたね。そのくらいに完全に飛行機マスターしてましたから、もう地上で自分の体を動かすよりも空中で、ゼロ戦操縦してバーッと向ける方が速くて確実に行くぐらいに、完全に飛行機そのものが自分になってました。戦闘機というのはですね、周り360度全部敵ですから、むしろこう敵を探すとか見張る場合には、私なんかもう前を2、後ろを9と。
前を2、後ろを9、なるほど。
翼の裏と胴体のここが一番怖いんです。見えないところですから。どっから来るか分かりませんが、年中腰をひねってですね、飛行機をひっくり返しながら、自分の後ろが大丈夫かってことを見て、前やパッと見れば分かりますから、もうすぐ気になりますから、これを気にならない人はやられるんです。私たち考えてましたのは、非常に重量を軽く作ってありますから、非常に機体全般が弱かったですね。それしかアメリカの飛行機には絶対そんなことないんですけども、もうこのゼロ戦には制限スピードというのがありまして、それを出すとパリッていくのが危ないんですね。いつも危険を感じてました。それから第2番目が、弾を食らった場合に、全く覚えようがないということです。最後のこれはパイロットあたりちょっとカバーしたり、タンクをちょっとやったりしましたけども、全般的に見てほとんど無防御という形ですから、やられたらもうライターのように火がつくと、そういう弱点があったですね。こちらから攻めていく場合、何百マイル飛んでいく場合には、もうどういうものか、日本軍は生きて旅衆の恥ずかしみを受けるという、絶対に捕虜にならないという考えでしたから、そういう強制されたもんじゃなかったんですけども、攻めていく場合には落下傘持ってきませんでしたね。落下傘はもちろん座布団、クッション代わりに持っていきますけども、バンドをもう置いていっちゃうんです。だから落下傘持っていかないと同じで、敵地上でやられたらもう自爆する以外ないと。今考えればもったいないことで、それで随分死んでるんですけどもね。右の目はほとんど見えなくなってますし、左の目もやられてもうほとんど失明状態で、コンパスが全然見えないんですよね。ちょうどここへ、一発はこういう弾が当たってますね。そしてこれへ抜けたんですね。
これ抜けてるわけですか。
でその時の傷がこの傷ですけどもね。それから一発はこっちから入って、でこれをかすったんですね。
なるほど。
だからほとんど失神状態で頭やられたってことも後で分かったんですけどもね。それからその時血を止めたのが最後のマフラーこれ残りまして、これで、血を止めたんですよ。この地図のようにですね、航路がめちゃくちゃでしょ。島も今のところ行ってしまって、このまま行ったらハワイ行ってしまうと思ったんです。ラボールはこの辺にあるような感じがするんですよ。自分の飛行の癖と飛行機の癖を見ましてね。それで見えた瞬間に起点が取れませんから、地球上のどこにいるかわからないですから、コンパス見えても、それどうもこの辺にあると思ったけどもね、ここまで来て30度や40度ケチケチするなと思ってですね、男らしく直角に曲がれと思って直角に曲がったわけですよ。それがドンピシャリ当たったわけです。こういうような15ラウンド戦ったボクサーの姿みたいですよね。顔の格好も歪んでしまって。
The only reason for an airplane to exist is to go fast. At the Great Air Meet in Rheims, Glenn Curtis set a world's record of just over 43 miles an hour, and the quest for speed was on. In 1913, Maurice Prévost was flying a streamlined Dépôt-Dessin monoplane at 126 miles an hour, and Europe claimed the lead in aviation speed. Immediately after World War I, quest for speed became a catalyst for the development of fighter planes. Countries which had not invested in new engines for their wartime fighters would, for reasons of national pride, invest in new engines to race them in peacetime. Then, in America in the 1930s, the situation reversed itself. Civilian aircraft, like the Travel Air Mystery Ship and the GB, Waddell Williams racers, became even faster than military aircraft. The reason was simple. The same engines were available to both civil racers and military fighters. The fighters had to carry guns, bombs, oxygen, and radios, while the racers were built only for speed. The world's absolute speed record was passed from country to country, and as the racers became faster and more powerful, they also became more expensive. America's Howard Hughes could afford to build his own racer, and with it set a land-plane speed record. But the absolute speed record of 440 miles an hour was set by a Macchi MC-72 seaplane in 1934, financed by the Italian government. Then military aircraft came back into the lead as the Heinkel and Messerschmitt firms competed for the title. The Messerschmitt Bf-109R set a speed record of 469 miles an hour in 1939, a record that lasted for many years. When the jet aircraft came out, speed records rapidly accelerated, the British breaking 1,000 miles an hour in 1956 in a Fairey Delta II. Speeds continued to climb, finally reaching 2,193 miles an hour in 1976 by the Lockheed SR-71, alias Blackbird. While speed was the object, there were many other benefits in creating ever faster aircraft. Improvement in fuels, streamlining, lubricants, materials, and the list goes on. Speed produced not only prestige and pleasure, but also utility. The speed record setters ultimately paved the way for commercial transports, business jets, and private planes.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.
Flying boats played an unforgettable role throughout World War II.